a slideshow that I put together for a little bit of a different titled class, but I think it's pretty much along the same lines, and will give you, kind of go along the same kind of thought process as we need to go through. So there's a couple things that I just wanted to go through initially from a foundational perspective, and that is, what is a CMA? So obviously it stands for Comparative Market Analysis. And the purchase in real estate is to determine the home or condo's value in today's market based on the best available data. But what a CMA is not is the seller's opinion of price, the proof of forever value, which some sellers love to think unless it's going up, then it's never, and then, or a guarantee of value. And I think that the reason I put this stuff in here is because I think that most sellers, if you ask them, these three things would factor in a big way into what they believe pricing should be about. And the reality is that we don't control the market, we only interpret the market. So in my opinion, as an agent, our goal is to take the available data and come up with the best opinion we can of that data, understanding that it's just an opinion though. And we could put 5 of us in a room that all knew a lot about pricing and come up with 5 different prices to list a house. And some of it may be what we would consider value, and some of it may be what we would consider strategy. I mean, the good thing in today's market, because of limited inventory, sometimes you can list a home for a price that's over the value, but still get something accepted, right? Whereas, but on the flip side, did we actually get the most amount of money we could get for the home in today's market? I think there's an argument to be made that the strategy for listing is just as important right now as the actual price that you listed at. And so the strategy should dictate what the price is, whether it's a seller who has all the time in the world and is willing to wait 45 days for the perfect buyer who's willing to pay their price, or whether it's a seller that has more motivation to move, which most of the time that's the case, even if it's just buying another property. And so what do we have to do to maximize the value of their property? So like I said, the real 2 main goals are to determine what a buyer will pay for the home in today's market, and the timing of it. And then also the second thing, when we're looking at a market analysis now, Michelle, for you, it's going to be less of a concern, at least in the onset, because most likely people aren't putting their house on the market next week. So they're just wanting to get like a snapshot in time of what their house is worth, kind of like maybe what a Zestimate would provide for somebody. But something that's actually going on the market, a huge part of your conversation should be, what is an appraiser going to appraise the home for? Because the reality is, unless you have a cash buyer or you have a buyer who's covering appraisal gap, it doesn't really matter what we go into contract at if the appraiser is going to come in 10% below that. Feel free to interject, ask questions, just blurt out. Don't raise your hand on Zoom. It's too hard to.
So I do have a question.
Yeah.
So when you do one of these and you present this to somebody, like in my case, so for example, I think it's more just people have a curiosity in today's market, which is why they were like, yeah, I'd love to get a CMA. How much time does that hold up? So for example, if I meet with someone on Saturday, go over it with them, we talk about it, and then in February, they're like, all right, we want to list our house. It's still like, I'd still have to say we'd have to redo the CMA just to kind of see what's changed, or like how often would I have to update them with the CMA so that they can get a more realistic picture about what their home is worth at the time they do want to sell?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is, I think, if you look at it technically, it's like by tomorrow, the CMA that you did today is outdated.
Yeah.
And in this market, I would say it's even more true than ever before in my 17 years. And the biggest reason is just because if one home that was listed next door for the same price that we're about to list for is actually in contract and sells for 50,000 more, and it's the exact same floor plan, then you've now just moved the needle in a big way, right? And so I would argue that updating it monthly is definitely appropriate in this environment, but certainly when you're listing a property, I usually do a market update like the day that I go live. Just because, again, if that one property is sold for way more than it was listed for, or sometimes less, right? Although that doesn't happen very often. Sometimes you make the assumption. It actually happened to me a couple weeks ago where the exact same, so I first met with these people in July, and we had a pretty good feeling of where the market was, but there were no exact comps. So it was a little bit of extrapolation, but it was kind of holding true. And then the exact same floor plan listed for the first time in the last 12 months, but it needed, and it needed work. And it listed right where we were going to list at. And I felt like, hey, we're in better condition. So I still feel good about that price. But then I realized that the square footage was wrong. And so to make a really long story short, it sold for 15,000 less than what we were going to list at. And it was in the 400 price range. And so I really had to have a heart-to-heart with the clients, because they also have this floor plan as the largest in the neighborhood. And so it's always hard to get an appraisal to be the highest sale in the neighborhood. And so in this scenario, I'm like, look, even though that place needs a bunch of work, the reality, which we'll get into in a second, is the appraisers are going to be looking at that property, and from the pictures, it's going to be hard to discern the condition that it's in. You know, I mean, and the reality is my listing was not the most updated listing either. Although it was in better condition, it was still like no major updates. And so, so we ended up listing it for what we were going to previously, them understanding what was going on. Now we ended up getting over list, so it all ended up working out. But the reality is that scenario was a perfect example of why, like, updating your market analysis right at the end is important. Because if I wouldn't have noticed that and had that conversation, and we didn't get offers listed at that 400 number, the seller would have been like, well, you promised me, you know, back in July that was going to be the number. And, you know, so now the expectation ended up not mattering. But I learned a long time ago that I would rather eat my words from July before it goes on the market than be like, oh my gosh, I told him 400, so let's just list at 400 and pray. Like, I'm having the conversation. Hey, we don't control the market, we only interpret it. We can still list at that. However, understand these are the things that I'm looking at that make me less confident in that number now. And I always tell people at the time that I give them a number, that the number can go up or it can go down between now and the time that we go on the market. So most of the time in this market, the number's up, right? I mean, I have a client who I last talked to, or who closed actually today, but I met with them first time February of this year. And their house, when I think we sold like 70,000 more than what we had originally talked about listing for, because the market obviously has adjusted a lot this year.
Is it still kind of the case even in November, if you were to get a house now, the market's still kind of going up?
So I would say right now, and that's one of the values of what we're looking at here is, you know, even though typically the CMA is going to be based a lot in what's happening in the individual neighborhood or area, it's certainly going to be important to look at the macro market, right? And so I'm always looking at what the macro market is doing. And one of the things I use trend graphics for a lot is just to talk about what does seasonality look like and how is that impacting. So I don't know if any of you guys, Seth, I think you were at the business planning last week, right? Michelle, were you there? You were there, yeah. So yeah, I did like a 20-minute or 30-minute presentation on looking at the numbers of the market currently. But right now is a dangerous time of the year for market analysis because the market can change. If seasonality continues to happen the way that it has, I would expect here over the next couple of weeks for us to like drop off of a cliff. But what I've seen over the last 2 weeks is the complete opposite of that. So either we're ramping up really fast with a bunch of people trying to get in before the holidays, or we're going to file after living in true seasonality in August and September, which I think that was more of a normal, that slowdown was very in line with normal. Right now, usually things are starting to trail off, and I feel like they're getting like buyer offers the last couple weekends have been just like losing out on, no inspection, no appraisal, 25,000 over list and still losing. Like that kind of stuff is crazy. And it's not, honestly, I feel like the market hasn't been this crazy probably since the beginning of the year. I feel like things were loosening up once spring came and more houses came on the market, and then certainly into July, August, and September, things loosened up a decent amount. But right now, the new listings have dropped off, but buyer demand has stayed pretty level. And that's kind of recreated a lot of what we were seeing earlier in the year. So I know this trend graphics is old, but what you're going to be looking for on here is just the seasonality of the market and to explain to the seller, what they can expect depending on what their time frame is for listing. And ideally, if you're a newer agent or you don't have a ton of experience with this, my recommendation would be my recommendation for everybody is always to ask a ton of questions up front about what their time frame looks like and try to find out, do as much of the pre-qualification as you can so that when you get there, you already know what you're talking to versus having to like on the fly figure out, okay, so what does this chart mean to somebody who's listing in July versus who's listing in January? Like you almost have to work through 50 different scenarios if you don't know that up front, if that makes sense. All right, so then, and this is going along kind of going down the appraisal road again, and why market analysis are different than appraisals. So what do buyers care about? They care about granite countertops, walk-in closets, pantry, finished basement, wood versus laminate. And how, and in this market, I feel like more than anything, how does this house compare to the one that I just lost out on last week or 3 months ago or whatever that timeline looks like? Is there anything else that I've missed here that you guys think of when you think of what buyers care about?
I was gonna say granite countertops. I have a buyer that's looking at around 300, and some of the homes I sent to them is like they don't have granite. Like it's really important to them that's in the kitchen.
Yeah. So in that case, though, so now we have the opportunity to educate them on what the cost of granite is. And are you really going to forego the perfect house because over $3,000, over 1% of the cost of your house? The other thing that I've done just to go down that bunny trail quickly, which I think is super valuable for you guys representing buyers in this market, is because there's not a lot of inventory to choose from. Sometimes buyers can make up their own list of desires and their own reality in terms of like, oh yeah, well, every $300,000 house has granite countertops, so that's what I want. So you go and like, let's say you're looking for $300,000 houses in Hilliard, you send them all the homes that have sold for 275 to 325 in Hilliard over the last 90 days and ask him, out of all of these houses on the market, how many would you have bought if they were on the market today? And so then you have the ability now, and I always tell buyers, if you look through that list and you find 15 that you would have bought, then our criteria is right in line. If you look through that list and you find one, then we have an issue. We have an expectations conversation to have. And the reality is too, we're also living in an interest rate environment where interest rates are rising. And so even somebody that just got pre-approved a month and a half ago, their payment for the same house is higher now, and that's without appreciating prices, right? And so drilling into that really quick so that you don't have to show somebody 50 houses, which will be like next November before you find 50 houses that they're gonna like to show them. Sending them those previously sold ones is a good way. And then what do appraisers care about? They care about square footage. Did you know that every appraiser measures each house? So sometimes, like that house I was talking about that just sold, the auditor had the house 1,000 square feet larger. They had a 2-story area in the back of the house that was like a 2-story great room. They had it as a finished second floor all the way across.
Oh, wow.
And so so in that situation, it listed at 3,600 square feet, and then the appraiser came, measured the house, realized it was incorrect, and then the buyer found out mid-contract that their house was actually only 2,500 square feet. So that can be a big deal. And we knew that ahead of time anyways, but I think it wasn't helping us from an appraisal perspective. Bedrooms matter. I say kind of because I had this long discussion one time with an appraiser about the difference between a 3-bedroom and a 4-bedroom. And he said that statistically, there's no difference in value. So there is a small difference between 2 and 3 bedrooms, but the adjustments are always way less on an appraisal than what a buyer thinks about it. Bathrooms, basement size, and whether it's finished or unfinished, the number of garage spaces, and then the solds. So I always say actives and in contracts mean almost nothing to an appraiser. So it doesn't matter what the house next door is in contract for. Now you can always send that information to the appraiser if you know it, but the reality is that they're going to place little value because the banks don't care until it closes. All right, so steps to a CMA. So the first thing that I'm going to look at is status. So we want to always look at active. I look at coming soons also, obviously. So coming soon, active, contingent, pending, and sold. Traditionally, I've always gone back 12 months. I would say I still go back 12 months just because of sometimes it takes that long just to get some good comps. But the reality is that this year with what appreciation has done, 12 months and what something sold for 12 months ago is almost completely irrelevant, with appreciation being 10 to 20% year over year. So if I do get, and I have seen some appraisers, which this is the first time in my career I've ever seen them doing this, but I have seen some appraisers that are actually making an adjustment based on when something sold. So I'm seeing them starting to sometimes make adjustments. Like if there was a specific floor plan that sold at the beginning of the year, they'll make an adjustment based on appreciation, research that they've done, but I wouldn't depend on that. And then expireds and withdrawns, which obviously in this market are slim to none. However, that's also an indicator. Can anybody think of a reason why those might be important?
They could give you a sense of what price itself out of selling.
Exactly. So in a declining market, especially like, let's say, or even just a softening market, I mean, I'd love to think that this market is going to last forever. It won't. And once we do, there'll be sellers that are overpriced. I mean, we already are seeing some sellers overpriced. I think, again, the decreased listings and stable demand has helped some sellers get lucky, even though they've overpriced their house. But the reality is, yeah, if something expires in this market, that means it's overpriced. So that definitely sets a ceiling for us in terms of price and condition for that location. So then the next place I'm going to drill into is going to be the area. So first I'm going to look at the subdivision itself. I mean, that's always going to be the best driver if there is a subdivision. If it's a rural property, that's even more difficult because there's so many more variables. But on rural properties, depending on how rural, appraisers will go up to 10 miles out. But even when I do that, I usually like to focus on the school district. So I might even draw a radius search around a property for 10 miles, but then I'll narrow it down to the school district. And then depending on where in the school district the property is located, which you'll tell once you narrow it down to school district, you'll see all the dots disappear that aren't. If it's right on the edge, then sometimes I'll look at the similar places that sold in the adjoining school district, just to kind of see what the differences in prices were, like try to find one in each district that sold around the same time that's similar and see was there a major price difference. But rural properties are difficult. Most of you are probably going to be doing most of your work in a subdivision. And so those are easier. The MLS hack with the subdivision would be to search the MLS. So select the active contingent pending sold for the last 12 months, which almost every subdivision should have a sale. Type in the subdivision. And from that, you'll be able to figure out what the boundaries of the subdivision are, and then draw a polygon around all of those houses, and then delete the subdivision name from the search and just use the polygon. And the reason is because some agents either use different subdivision names or don't put one in at all. And so if you only use subdivision as a criteria, then you'll miss some, and you could miss one that's exactly the same comp, right? So the worst thing ever, and this is the reason, I don't remember the house, but I remember a house where I was sitting in the listing presentation, felt really super prepared. And then they're like, oh yeah, well, what about our neighbor's house? And the neighbor's house did not have the subdivision listed. So yeah, so never use subdivision as a criteria again for my market analysis, or only the subdivision. And then you're going to pay attention to the style of the property. So style can make a big difference, especially when you're looking at price per square foot of something. Style, the difference between a 1,500 square foot ranch and a 1,500 square foot 2-story or even split level or bi-level is pretty significant in terms of the way that it lives. So I would say the order that these are listed in terms of style is typically from the most expensive price per square foot all the way down to the lowest price per square foot.
It's a duplex ever play in with that? What's the curveball I got thrown? All right.
Yeah, duplexes. So duplexes and multifamilies in general tend to be priced more so off of the income that they generate than the size. I won't say that's a guaranteed comp, but then that income. Now the challenge is, what if you have, which this happens a lot, especially in older, more established areas. What if you have somebody who just sold a property and the tenant's been there for 15 years and they're paying $700 a month, but market rent is $1,100 a month? So is that property worth what 1,100 a month would make it worth, or is it worth what 7, or is it somewhere in between? Again, I would say traditionally it's whatever it's rented for now has been the guideline. And a savvy investor would be fine buying it and selling, raising rents, turning it over potentially, and increasing the value. In this market today, it's probably worth whatever the 1,100 makes it worth. But I would say the biggest differentiator on duplexes is going to be the number of bedrooms. Bathrooms are less important than bedrooms, just because bedrooms usually determine how much you're going to be able to rent for. And so therefore you'll usually see like a 3-bedroom rent for substantially more, which then in turn creates more value. Does that make sense? And then also basements and garages, just area to store stuff, will also play into that a decent amount. So then the next thing I would use to narrow things down would be square footage. And we can jump into an example of the MLS here in a second. But so first, again, this is kind of narrowing the funnel, right? So if I didn't have a ton of comparables that were exactly the same, which is true in a lot of subdivisions, especially the higher up in price you go, the more of a difference you'll see between properties within the same subdivision, then square footage is another good guideline to use. Remember that from an appraising perspective, the appraisers typically are only counting the above ground square footage. Even if you have a walkout basement, which theoretically should be able to count as normal square footage, typically it doesn't. The rule is that more than half of the level has to be above ground in order for it to be considered livable square footage. Because even on split levels and bi levels, again, it depends on the appraiser sometimes as to how they count that, but typically they're going to count the upstairs different than they do that finished lower level, even though the auditor does not count it different. And then bedrooms, bathrooms, we've talked about already. Basement, yes, no, finished, unfinished, full or partial, all those things will qualify for adjustments on an appraisal. I would tell you that other than finished versus unfinished, I typically am not getting this deep into the weeds on a market analysis for a client. I would say everything above the basement is more so what I'm looking at. The biggest thing I'm looking at in these remaining things is going to be, is there something that's unique for the neighborhood one way or the other? Meaning, is there something that this house has that no other house in the neighborhood has? Or is there something that almost all the houses in the neighborhood have that this house doesn't have? So since an example of that would be if almost every comp has a 2-car garage, but mine has no garage. Or every comp has a finished basement, but mine has no finished basement. Those are things that I'm going to be really nervous about and want to make a good adjustment. And that's actually not something that the appraiser is going to adjust a lot for. They will adjust for it, but not as much as the buyers will. But I mean, for example, last spring, I guess, I had, not this year, but the year before. So it was during the pandemic, which makes it kind of weird, but it's still a good example. I had the lowest price per square foot built home in Lewis Center in a great neighborhood in McCammon Chase. It was a great house. In my opinion, for the neighborhood, probably it was a former model. And so it had like it had a paver driveway. Okay. And we had it listed at like 525, and we were getting showings, but it wasn't selling. And the reason, now it would sell for a lot more now, but the reason was because it didn't have a finished basement. So even though it had all the space, all the comps had finished basements, and that's just what people wanted. They wanted finished basement. This one didn't have a loft or a finished basement, so they didn't have like that second living area, and the cost to finish it was going to be higher than what they could go buy a little bit more expensive house for at a little bit higher price per square foot. So the appraiser wasn't going to give us that much of a deduction because finished basements aren't worth that much on an appraisal, but the buyer market was saying, I really want the finished basement. And so therefore we had to come down in price. And in my opinion, we had to sell it for way less, or a decent amount less than what we would have gotten for it. I mean, putting in a new basement may have been a wash, but obviously not worth the headache. So condition and finishes, again, almost never matter on an appraisal. That's something I'm paying attention to more in a different market. I mean, obviously, if you have really significant finish differences, you're going to want to factor that in. But I would say I've never been in a market in 17 years where finishes matter less than they do right now. The gap between over improved and unimproved is smaller than it's ever been. And then lot location and size. So the thing I'm looking for there, once I narrow down comps, a lot of times I'll switch over to the map view and I'll just like on the MLS and go to satellite. So it's going to show me what's happening around the house. And I'm just going to flip through all of the properties to see if anything's backing up to power lines, railroad tracks, or main roads. Or is everything backing up to woods except for this house I'm listing, right? Or vice versa. So then you're going to narrow it down to the most alike properties. That again, identifying things that seem to be affecting the price the most, and then look at the satellite view as well as the pictures. Select the properties. Usually I like to keep it to like the top 3 to 5. Sometimes I'll go up to 7 if there's enough. If there's like a bunch that are good, or if there's either a lot that are very much alike or there's almost none that are exactly like the comp, I'll be a little bit more liberal with the numbers just to try to give some more value. And in that case too, a lot of times the seller, especially in today's world, the seller is very aware that they have a unique property. And so what they're going to choose, they probably already looked at the houses that they think are going to be most like theirs. And so I want to do my best to like have that one with me and understand that one a little bit so that they're not like, well, what about 123 Main Street and I don't have it. So sometimes, like, and going back to the neighbor example, usually if there's a house that's sold within like seeing distance of the front porch, even if it's nothing like the house, I'll print that off and at least bring it with me, just because I know they're probably asking about that one because they know what that house sold for. So that's another thing. Be prepared to compare it to the neighbor's house. So then I'm going to I print the entire neighborhood on a 1-line CMA. And sometimes I'll do this electronically. I still feel more comfortable with paper because I feel like it allows for better rapport building between myself and the seller than handing them a computer screen. But this year I have been trying just because it pains me to print all that paper and then throw it away after talking about it for 5 minutes. But the 1-line CMA from the MLS just gives you a really good snapshot of the neighborhood. And I use that. The biggest thing I use that one for, first of all, I like to have every house that sold in the neighborhood in case I didn't print one off that they ask about. So at least I've got like the basics, like the address, the bedrooms, bathrooms, square footage, what it sold for, when it sold. Because just sold can mean anything from yesterday to 3 years ago when it comes to a neighbor. So sometimes I'll be like, oh, I don't have that. I don't know why. And then I'll look it up on my phone. And it's like, this sold 2.5 years ago, guys. Like, this has no relevance in what the value of your house is today. So I'll show you guys how to do that. So example pricing, you're just going to talk on each of the 3 to 5 comps that best are most similar to yours, whether they're the basement, the square footage, pre-COVID versus post-COVID pricing. So this year it would be like early bird pricing, earlier in the year versus now, keeping in mind the 10 to 20% upgrades, the finishes, yard size, location, neighborhood versus area. If you guys email me, I can send you this slide deck if you're interested. And then this is an example appraisal, just to kind of show you. And I don't know why those are. I think it covered everything I was actually trying to highlight instead of highlighting. I'm like, why did I block that out? But this is just, if you guys haven't ever reviewed an appraisal, this is what an appraiser uses. And the biggest thing I wanted to get to here was just show you, if it doesn't fall into one of these categories on here, the appraiser is not taking it into account. So I always just tell sellers, like, there's no box on an appraisal that says, does the house have granite countertops? Or does it have, stainless steel appliances?
But you suggested that those sorts of details do drive the
Buyer traffic, right?
So do you do 2 separate CMAs, one for the appraiser and one for the buyer?
No, because the reality is both matter. Right. So I tell the seller, just because we get a buyer that's willing to pay X amount, and this is where I represent my value to the transaction too. So when we talk about pricing strategy, we're not just talking about what can we get a buyer to pay for it. We're talking about what we can actually get to the closing table with in your pocket. So what we may want to do is price the property a little below what we think that we might be able to get for it in order to drive multiple offers and get the terms that we want. Because the reality is, like in that scenario that I was talking about earlier, if you have a house that's listed for 400, the highest sale in the neighborhood's 385, and you get an offer for 440, unless they're waiving appraisal or paying cash, that 440 offer, in my opinion, is worthless. You might as well have a 385 offer.
You assume they won't cover appraisal gap?
No, I don't assume, but then I'm going to point out the fact that that's an important component. So if we price it at 425 because we think the market's going to be there, and then we only get one offer, and because we only have one offer, we don't get waived inspection, we don't get appraisal gap coverage, we don't get any of that stuff, then we're shooting ourselves in the foot. But if we get a super competitive situation where people are bidding against each other, they're forced to give us those terms that we really want and or need. And the reality is, at least in our current marketplace, most sellers are getting way more money than they ever thought they would for their house anyways. And so from that perspective, they're like, okay, whatever, for the most part, unless there's, have a really big need for the money. Yeah, it's unfortunate that this came through like this, because I think everything that I wanted to talk about is underneath the highlighter. But basically what I did want to point out here in this section is that then the appraiser does go through and actually like explains why they chose the price that they did, and what those differences are. Oh, there it is without highlight. So yeah, I do think that pricing though, currently in the market, you do have to give value to the active comps for sure. I've noticed the MLS was kind of slapping us on the wrist for changing the price of properties. If it goes well above list price, I've noticed more and more agents doing that again. The other thing that I would encourage you to do, because I just sold a place where we ended up taking not the highest price that we got, but the buyer agreed to pay a bunch of seller closing costs. And so when I went to close it out in the MLS last week, I was kind of like, man, this like kind of feels dirty, because like the other buyers that lost out on this property are going to look at the sold price and think that like, well, how come they took that one? Like I put in a much higher offer, when in reality, the seller netted way more money. And obviously our bar for appraisal was lower. And so I think I'm going to start putting in the agent to agent remarks, what the additional terms were around that sale, just so other agents know, because it can be significant. I mean, Ashley just lost out on one with a buyer this weekend, and it's like, significant seller closing costs paid. And so, those come up as sales, like for list price or whatever, and buyers are like, what the heck? So, I mean, we've seen as much as 25-30 grand and seller paid closing costs, like full commissions on, $500,000-$600,000 houses. And so that makes a big difference. So again, only in the same neighborhood, can't ignore low priced homes. Remember, the appraiser is not attached to the outcome of the appraisal. So just remember, just because something sold and was an outlier, it's still probably going to show up in the appraisal report. Style, square footage, basement, no basement, deck, patio, location. We talked about that. What to do if there's no neighborhood comps? Go back in time more than 12 months. Look at expireds and withdrawns. Look at the same style, same price range, same school district or area. So if there are no good comps in the neighborhood, go out a little bit further, but try to stay within the same price range and area.
Keep an eye. I just thinking of one I ran last week. Something that's their home was just above 270. So like when I just tried to do like the standard CMA through Brevity, was including homes down below, which was pretty much Worthington.
Yep.
So I had to actually go and do the whole polygram thing. Is that common, or should I still at least include it in my report that, yeah, here are the homes just beneath you on the other side?
I mean, the answer is it just depends on, what the differences is. Now, obviously that market I'm very familiar with, so I will tell you there's a big difference.
Yeah.
And so I would say I would, whenever possible, I would stay within a subdivision. So I would not do like the radius search. The only time I do that is rural. And really, you would have to prove to me that I should go outside of the school district by saying that either it doesn't matter, in some ways this school district is better, before I would comp outside of the district. So like in that scenario, I would absolutely search for the subdivision and then do the polygon around that subdivision first. But then in that case, I would also, if I had to expand, I would expand further up. The other thing that you could do in that scenario, and this is true in a lot, would, especially within like the suburbs of Columbus, would be, that's the difference between Columbus Worthington schools and Worthington schools. So everything south of 270. So that would be another way that you could look at it, would be like anything that's in Columbus, but also in 43085 versus, and that would give you all of that stuff up off of Sankis, for example. So there's a lot of different ways. The polygon's the easiest way, because if you don't know where all the zip code lines are and all that stuff, it would take you longer to figure that out.
Yeah. Cause like when I just did like the generic, when I saw like what it was bringing up, like, whoa.
Yeah. I would recommend using the MLS and using the polygon as often as possible if it's within a subdivision. So yeah, considerations on offers, we've kind of already talked about this, but as is inspection, no inspection, appraisal gap coverage, waiving the appraisal, lack of home warranty, closing and possession are all things that, could strengthen the offer outside of price. And then this is the script that I use. It's in my listing presentation, and you guys can feel free to R&D it. But I always say remember we have to sell your home 5 times. So first we have to sell it to the agent. I don't know about you guys, but I don't think most agents get super excited about showing houses anymore, because they know there's probably a 80% chance that the buyer's not buying that house. And so agents, are looking up the houses when their buyer sends it to them, trying to figure out why they shouldn't waste their time or the buyer's time going to look at it. So first we have to do that. And this is saying that as well. The second person is we have to sell it to the buyers themselves, obviously, and mom and dad sometimes. The third person is the inspector. So even though some contracts come with no inspection, obviously most do have some kind of inspection. So remember, there's going to be that whole conversation, and they get hired to find problems. So unless there's no inspection, and then sometimes they create them if they can't find them. So what I've started to tell sellers is actually we need to leave a couple things that aren't going to keep your home from selling, but that normally are relatively easy fixes just for the inspector to find, so that they have something to put on the report that we are fine fixing. Because even new builds have issues, is what I always tell people, because they almost always do. The appraiser is the big one in this market. So the appraiser needs to know why your house is worth what it's worth. So I always send the appraiser like a summary, essentially, of what's happened. Like, how many offers did we get? How many showings did we have? What are the updates that the seller's done? Any kind of information that they would not be able to know without me giving it to them.
Do you go to the lender to get the appraisers email?
No, when you're the listing agent, they have to set a showing up through you. So, and except for the rare circumstances of a drive-by appraisal, but that usually is not something that happens. Some appraisers do get offended if you try to tell them what it should be valued at. So you kind of have to tiptoe around that issue by just providing information. Sometimes I will call them if I'm really worried about it. Some agents, even in our office, will meet the appraiser, meet every appraiser at the house. I don't think that's bad practice, but it just takes a lot of time. So I do that sometimes if I really feel, and I just try to schmooze them, basically. Definitely wouldn't go and try to do their job for them. But I do offer to do it, because sometimes appraisers are lazy and they want you to do their job for them. And so I'm happy to do that if you want me to. And the information is going to look the way I want it to. And then the last person is the underwriter. This is the one most people forget about. But in a shifting market, it's going to be a really important one. And what I mean by that is, someday when the market starts to slow down, the underwriters at the bank will get really conservative, and they'll push back on the appraisers and tell them like they want more reason for the price to be justified than what they've given them. And so they have the ability to actually like basically throw the appraisal out if they want. So yeah, so that's it. What other questions do you guys have?
I have a question about land. Like, how do you go about doing an appraisal for land? Or is that even a thing?
Yeah, very similar. It can be much more difficult because there's a lot more variables usually with regards to location specifically, and then also land use. But I would usually start with the school district.
Okay.
And similar sized lots. So I don't know if you have an example.
Well, I have somebody that he wants to buy about 7 to 10 acres to build on in the next 5 years. And he just said within Olentangy schools, but I feel like that's next to impossible to find right now.
He wants to build on it in 7 to 10 years.
No, he wants to build on it within 5 years.
Okay.
He wants to buy it now.
I mean, yeah, so I would just, well, I mean, the short answer on anything that has low, that there's low inventory on, sometimes it's going to be what's he willing to pay for it and what's important to him about buying it now.
Okay.
And then I would just set him up on a land search.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, you can just do pricing once properties come available.
Yeah. Because I feel like just looking on the MLS from what I've seen, the prices seem all over the place, couple $100,000 and then there's multi-million dollar. It just seems very like hard to, I guess, get a grasp on like what land would be worth.
Yeah, it definitely can be. Whoops, I lost you guys here. Hold on. Go with Mac. Oh, look at that. I'm learning. All right. Yeah, it can be more difficult. But I would say, it works very similarly though. Sometimes with land too, you may want to go back 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
But with land, the big thing to remember is you've got some different variables to keep in mind. I mean, some of the things that you need to look at are like availability of utilities. If depending on whether, so if public sewer is not available, then you have to look at the soil conditions of for a septic system, especially on larger lots. The lot prep can be really, really expensive.
Do we have anyone in the office that specializes in land stuff that I could talk to? Because
Mark Chambers would be a good person to talk to because he's a builder.
okay.
Ryan Reynolds has a pretty good experience with land.
Okay.
I know enough to be dangerous. But those are the big things are definitely of utility availability. And then if public sewer is not available, the soil, and then the lot prep. The lot prep is the thing that a lot of buyers don't think about, meaning like if you buy a wooded lot, do you know how much it costs you to clear the trees and put a driveway in?
Yeah. Well, he says he wants the land right now so he can hunt on it. So he does want it to be wooded, but then he's fine with clearing some of it to build a house on for his family down the road.
Yeah. I mean, somebody like him is probably going to be a lot easier because if he's looking, but finding land to hunt on in Olentangy schools, there's not very many options left.
Right.
Unless you're a millionaire.
Right.
And maybe he is a millionaire.
He could very well be. I don't know. It was,
but yeah, I would first ask him his budget.
Okay.
And then if he's looking to hunt, I don't know the answer. Maybe somebody else on here does, but I'm sure there's like a minimum distance acreage or whatever that you have to be, depending on what kind of hunting he's looking to do. Bow hunting, he can probably do.
Yeah.
On almost anything, but so yeah, I would research any of those types of deed restrictions or area restrictions. That's another thing with any kind of land, is just make sure there's no restrictions for whatever they want to do with it. Because a lot of times people that buy acreage think that they can just do whatever they want, which is relatively true in very rural settings, but in Olentangy schools, there are a lot of rules in Delaware County that you have to follow.
Yep. Okay. All right. Thanks for that.
Yeah. Anybody else?
So typically when realistic to flex that MLS versus like what's the RPR?
Yeah, I'll use realist sometimes. I've tried to get more in the habit of it just because, but there's still not a huge number of for sale by owners off market stuff that sells that doesn't get put in the MLS at some point. So that's the biggest reason to go do that. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think doing the subdivision search is going to be the strongest. I mean, RPR can give you a good estimate, but the reality is it's just an automated valuation tool, just like Zillow.
Yeah.
Although, but yeah, so it gives you a guideline, but in terms of what, in my opinion, the seller is looking for from us, I think you need to go deeper than that. For just that example that you gave is the perfect one. And even I always use the example that, like, you know, a computer is going to look at a 3,500 square foot house with the same number of bedrooms and bathrooms built and within 2 years of each other is exactly the same. But if one's a foreclosure that's completely trashed and the other one's over improved, are you really telling me that that's worth this exact same amount of money? No, but the computer thinks it is. So, and those algorithms I think will continue to get better over time. But right now, I mean, I just read an article over the weekend that in Phoenix, Zillow, using their Zestimate, 93% of the properties that they bought in their iBuyer program were listed below what they paid for them.
Yeah.
So if that doesn't tell you not to trust automated models as anything other than like a rough estimate, then I don't know. Cool. Anybody else? Seth, Scott, Heather, Pete? Good. All right. Well, I appreciate you guys. What's that?
So I don't have trend graphics. Is there something similar that's cheap?
You do have
cheaper
trend
that you
graphics.
recommend? What was that?
You do have trend graphics.
Oh yeah, what? I do?
Yeah.
No way.
Yes. Our office has a subscription.
Oh.
Yeah. So if you email actually mykwcresources.com or KW, it's KWC,
Yeah.
not my KWC, kwcresources.com. The login and password are on there.
Okay.
Look
That's
at
great
that.
news.
That's great.
I just put it in the chat, Seth, if you, and
Thanks,
it's just,
Michelle.
if you scroll all the way down to the bottom and then there's the username and the password.
Are you
Okay.
gonna do another class on that? Please, please, please.
Maybe sometime soon.
You have some stuff on.
It's on YouTube though too, Heather. You can watch it
I
over and
know,
over
but
and
I'd
over
rather
and
see you
over.
do it.
All right, I'll get
Okay.
that on the calendar too.
Thank you.
All right, awesome. Cool. Well, I appreciate you guys. And just feel free to reach out if I can ever help in any other way.
All right, thank you. That was very helpful. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks. See ya.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Always. Oh, turn it off. Hey, Troy. Sorry about that. I was talking about it. No, that's okay. I've been on Zoom all day. I'm good.